right, let's go ahead and we'll get in our seats so we can begin our Sunday school hour. Looking forward to our special guest today, Pastor Daniel Ruley. He's actually no stranger to many of us. He has basically grown up in the church, and there's a great history here that he has with our church. And if he wants to talk about that, we'll let him do so. But he was with us, I think, back during the COVID times. If you remember when we had the outside fire going on, he was here and he spoke that day. That's the last I remember him being here. But he is back to visit, and he's going to join us today from Brazil. So I'm going to give him most of the time, all the time actually, that he needs right now. And we're looking forward to hearing him. So Brother Dan, if you'll come.
Good morning. It's good to be here this morning, and I can say it's like being home to be here this morning in Morgantown. It's good to look out and see lots of familiar faces of people that have known me longer than I've known them. Well, at least I was unconscious of that because I grew up here as a baby, as a kid. So it's good to see lots of people that know me and my family, and also lots of new people as well. A mark of a healthy church and that God is working is that there are always new people, and then there are also faithful people. God moves us on to different places. But I send greetings from my family. My parents are now in Jacksonville, Florida, teaching at a Christian school. They've been there for about 10 years now, and I know many of you remember them, so they're doing well. He's living in central Pennsylvania, working there. And then I've got a brother, Peter, who's living in the Pittsburgh area, and then a brother, James, who's living in Atlanta. So not all of us are missionaries, contrary to popular opinion. Though at some time there were 3 of us that were on the mission field in our family. But it is good to be here this morning to send greetings from our church in Brazil and to share with you a little bit about what God's doing in Brazil, a little bit about our ministry. And unfortunately, we do have the entire Sunday school hour, but time goes really fast, and I have a lot of things that I'd like to share. But I just want to give you kind of a general idea of where we live and what we're doing. I'm going to show a 3-minute video, and then I'm going to walk through some specific details of what God's doing. If we have a chance, we'll ask a few questions, or I'll let you ask a few questions at the end. We've been living in Northeast Brazil for about 8 years, and God's taught us a lot of different things through that time. Brazil is a very large country, as you probably know. It's as large as the 48 United States, and it's a tropical country, so we don't have to worry about cold where we live, which is really nice. If you hate winter, you should come live in Brazil, because we literally never have to wear coats, never have to look at the weather, never have to worry about rain. In fact, when rain does come, we go out and be in the rain because it's enjoyable, because we don't have that much rain. So it's a completely different kind of life than you might expect. God's called us to the northeast region of Brazil, which is not the Amazon rainforest. Most of you are familiar with the Amazon rainforest. You probably watched something on the Discovery Channel or something like that. God definitely didn't call me to primitive ministry, because I couldn't imagine living out in the jungle and doing that kind of ministry, though I have had some opportunities to visit the Amazon in the last couple of years. We also don't live in southern Brazil. Most people have heard of the city of São Paulo or Rio de Janeiro, which are large cities in Brazil. They're also very dangerous cities. If you look in movies, you can find movies about the violent drug culture of the southern cities. And just to preempt maybe one of your questions, Brazil is not a safe country to live in lots of different ways. It was interesting because as Pastor Johnny was talking about movie bandits or movie thieves in his message this morning, I was thinking, I can give you real life examples of people that have been robbed, neighbors of our church members who was actually assaulted. People followed him home, went into his house, almost killed him trying to find money in his house. This happens on a regular basis in Brazil. So Brazil is not a safe country to live in, and we also don't have guns to protect ourselves. So we really are at the mercy of God, which really we all are. We put a lot of confidence in our guns and our alarm systems, but God is ultimately the one that protects us. But Northeast Brazil is different than both Amazon and the southern cities. It's a more rural area of Brazil. We are interior, so we're about 7 hours from the city of Fortaleza on the coast. We're about 7 hours from the city of Recife on the other coast of Brazil. So we're out in the country, literally. In fact, we use an expression for Northeasterners. They're called caipiras, which we would translate to be hillbillies. And that's literally the way that Brazilians think of Northeastern people. No real connection with hillbillies in the United States, but that idea of country people. And so we see a lot of differences in the way people live. Most of the people that we live are much poorer. They can live with a lot less, but there also are not a lot of opportunities for our people. But through all that, God has worked in lots of amazing ways. We're thankful for how he has given us a ministry in Northeast Brazil. We're part of a group of churches called Regular Baptist Churches that God has been working in for over 75 years. And God has developed his church. God has planted his church in Northeast Brazil to the point where there are very few missionaries left in Northeast Brazil, American missionaries. There are about 5 missionary families with our mission board in the entire Northeast Brazil region, which includes 8 states. So there's lots of needs, there's lots of opportunities, and there's very few missionaries. But saying that, I'll say that God works in his church, and God plants churches, God saves people, and the goal of missions is ultimately that the gospel is planted, churches are established, and ultimately that the churches develop their own desire for missions, their own desire for evangelism, and we don't need nearly as many missionaries. Our goal as a missionary is to share the gospel in places where the gospel is not heard, to plant the seeds and see how God uses us to partner with other people, believers from the national country, in this case Brazilians, who are planting churches and who are sharing the gospel. So we're excited to see how God has been doing that. We are partnering with Brazilian churches in Brazil. We are still in a very needy mission field where the majority of people are Roman Catholic. Northeast Brazil is highly Roman Catholic. 80 to 90% of people claim to be Roman Catholic. And so there's a huge need for gospel preaching churches. But we're able to partner with churches that want to plant churches, that want to share the gospel, and we're seeing that happen. And so we are not alone. Sometimes it feels like we're alone, but we're able to work with churches in our surrounding area. We live in a city called Cajazeiras. Unfortunately, most of the names of places where we've lived are difficult to pronounce in English. So Cajazeiras is where we live. You can ask me if you want to try to pronounce that a little bit later. But we moved there about 5 years ago with the desire to plant a church. Cajazeiras is a university city. Okay, now it's a little bit different than living in a place like Morgantown, but there is a university in our city. So there are lots of students that come into our city. They study for 4 years and then they leave, just like here in Morgantown. So we have an opportunity to reach out to students that come into our city, but we also have an opportunity to reach the people of Cajazeiras. The more we've gotten to know the city over the last 5 years, we've seen there are very few churches that actually preach the gospel. There may be 2 or 3 in the entire city, a city of about 60,000 people. Most of the churches are neo-Pentecostal, so they preach a prosperity gospel. They're all about screaming and yelling and making all kinds of spiritual demonstrations, if you will. You've probably seen churches like that. And so very few people are actually grounded in the scriptures. Very few people know how to actually read the Bible for themselves. And so we were put into this task of planting a church. When we started the church, we only had one couple that wanted to start a church with us. And so imagine trying to start a church and you have no structure, so you have no building, you have basically no people, you're a foreigner, you barely speak the language because we had been living in Brazil for about 2.5 years when we moved to this city. Where do you start? It's a good question. Most of us have never been in that situation, right? We take for granted that we have a good church, right? Makes me think of Pastor Moran, how many over 50 years ago when he started the church. You know, where do you start? You have to find people, right? You have to become part of the community. You have to find out what people need, how you can interact with them, how you can share the gospel with them, how you can bring people to understand that the gospel is the most important thing, bring them to saving knowledge of Jesus Christ, gather a group together. There's a lot of things involved in planting a church. So we're thankful for God has given us a group of people. Finally, after 5 years, we have about 30 people in our church, 19 adults and 11 kids, but it's been a long, slow process. When we came back, and I'll show the video in just a second, when we came back to Brazil in 2020 after the pandemic, our church basically shut down during the pandemic. We had 8 months where there were no services in Cajazeiras. And so when we went back to Brazil at the end of 2020, we thought, well, our church still exists, right? Imagine not holding services for 8 months at the church. What's going to happen? Depends, right? I would hope that many of you would remain faithful to the church, right? But you got to be fed somewhere. What's going to happen? We didn't have anyone that could actually handle the church. And so I was a little bit afraid that when we went back to Brazil that we might not have anybody, or we'd only have a few people. We had to restart. But I'm very thankful how God worked in our weakness. We didn't think that it was going to happen, but when we went back, all of our people were still there. We had a meeting in our house the very first Sunday that we got back to Brazil, and every single person that had been attending our church came to our house, including unbelievers who had been attending our church on a regular basis. They all came to our house as well, and they're like, let's restart. Preach to us. Share the gospel with us. Let's learn from the Bible. And so God preserved his church during the pandemic. It's been a discouraging time for me in lots of different ways. God has shown me lots of my own weaknesses. When I think of this last 3 years in Brazil, I think of the verse 2 Corinthians 4:7. We have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the excellency of the power may be of God and not of us. A lot of times we think we have all the answers, right? I'm able to share the gospel. I'm well prepared and well equipped, even more so when you're a missionary or a pastor. You say, man, I can do this, right? The reality is that God uses us, okay? But ultimately, it's God that saves people. It's God that changes lives. It's God that grows his church. And we've seen that happen over the last 3 years. So we're going to go and show a video that's kind of a highlight of the last 3 years, some of the things that have happened, and then I'm going to walk through a number of different areas of our ministry, and then hopefully giving you a chance to ask a few questions at the end. Okay, so there's lots of things there. As my son Andrew likes to say, when you watch a missionary presentation, you could stop every single picture and tell a story 3 to 5 minutes for each picture. So there's lots of information to share. I want to go to the very end of the presentation and share a couple things with you. First off, one of the things I learned as we were starting to plant a church, when you try to begin to plant a church, there's lots of things that you think you know, lots of things you assume you know, and you start to realize church planting is not an easy thing to do. And the plans that you make or that you don't make have a direct impact on church planting. One of the things we've begun to realize, and I mentioned this earlier, but as missionaries, we plant churches, and we take advantage of lots of different things. We take advantage of the money that we can get from the United States. We take advantage of lots of experience that we have, lots of training that we have in Bible college or in other fields in the United States. But when you're in a foreign country, your goal is to help other people plant churches as well. If you're the only missionary in a location, you're going to plant a church and you are it. But if you have other churches around you, you want to encourage them to plant churches as well. And so one of the things that is unique about the Northeast Brazil field is that there are lots of places to plant churches by yourself, but there are also lots of good, solid churches that want to plant churches, that see the need for gospel evangelism around them, and they're trying to figure out how to plant churches as well, okay? One of the things we found out as well is lots of our churches don't really know how to plant churches, and they're just going through the motions. They need guidance, they need help. And so as we've been planning this church for the last 5 years in Cajazeiras, we've gathered together a group of men. As of now, there are 10 men that are part of this group, where we've studied church planting. We're looking at the best ways to plant churches in Northeast Brazil. We're learning together. Each one of us represents at least one church plant. And next year, we're going to be doing a conference on church planting that is led by these men, not led by myself as a missionary. I'm just part of this group, where we're going to be encouraging our churches in church planting, in seeing their church as a church that can plant another church, and helping them to figure out how to do that. A lot of church plants happen where somebody's living in another location, there isn't a good church, and so they start holding services in the person's house, and then it kind of goes from there, but it gets stuck. And the church becomes what we call a congregation, where it becomes a satellite of the other church, and they may have 20 people in the church, and the people attend the church and they hold services, but they're not able to become an independent church. And so they're connected to another church, but they're not able to start their own ministry and continue to expand. Our goal is that there will be more churches planted in Northeast Brazil through the Brazilian churches. And so it's been a neat opportunity to talk with these men on a weekly basis, to find some church planting classes. What we found in Brazil, there's lots of material. There are lots of books on church planting, but there's very few people teaching other people how to plant churches, okay? Even here in the United States, it's something that is a challenge, how to plant churches. What we found is the only courses on church planting were put out by Presbyterians. That doesn't mean that they're doctrinally Presbyterian in what we're doing, but we were able to go take a look at those church planting courses, take out what was helpful for us as church planters, and apply it to a Baptist context. And so I'm thankful for this group of men. They're excited about church planting. In fact, they're pushing me. They're saying, you could do this too. We want to encourage you. And so that's been a neat opportunity. Another part of our ministry is called Bible Training Centers. In Brazil, we have a few Bible colleges. In fact, we have a Bible college about 2 hours away from us. It was founded 75 years ago, so it's quite an old institution. But not everyone is able to go to Bible college to become a pastor. In fact, a big challenge that we have in Brazil, just like in the United States, is there aren't enough pastors to pastor our churches. There aren't enough good pastors. There's lots of men that go into the ministry and then become disqualified from ministry. And there's always a need to train new pastors for ministry. There's different ways you can do that. A Bible college is a very good way to do that. But not everyone is able to financially go to Bible college, to pick up and move and study at a Bible college. There are some people that need to be mentored into ministry. Bible training centers is a way for churches to train their men within their own churches. It's designed not just for training pastors, but also for training leaders in the church, to have a good grounding in Bible interpretation, in teaching and preaching, in a biblical understanding that can be complemented with biblical counseling for people to be ministers within their local church and to be trained within their local church. One of the advantages is they're able to study in their local church on a weekly basis. They're able to attend their local church and minister in their local church without having to go to a Bible college. And so in a place where there are not always options for Bible colleges, it's been very effective. I oversee over 20 churches that use this course on a regular, consistent basis. We've seen numbers of people graduate from this program, go on to be church planters, go on to be missionaries. Some of them go on and study at a Bible college after this. But it's a neat opportunity for me to be connected with lots of different churches and to do interactions. We have a project in the Amazon. I was there last year. I plan to go again this next year, where we have numbers and numbers of churches that don't have trained pastors. They're asking someone to come and train them for ministry, but no one can do that. Or they don't have people that can do that. And so we have a number of missionaries, American missionaries, and also Brazilians that we're working together to help train pastors. There are churches in the Amazon where there are actually physical buildings that someone came and built the church building in a community, but it's way out in the middle of nowhere, and they have no one to preach in that location. But God needs to send people. We need to be training people to fulfill those opportunities to be laborers. When I was out there in the Amazon, I was like, man, maybe I shouldn't be living in Cajazeiras. Maybe I should go out and be preaching in some of these churches. But there's a great need in the Amazon, and Bible training centers fulfills that need. Some of you may remember in 2019, I had the opportunity to go to Mozambique. We have missionaries from Brazil that are serving in Mozambique. It's an African country that speaks Portuguese. And there are multiple men over there that need to be trained as well for ministry. There is no solid Bible college in that location. And so we'll be partnering with that missionary. He's actually in Brazil studying in our Bible college right now. And we're going to be partnering with him to start a Bible Institute in another year over in Mozambique. And so using most likely this material. So we have a broad reach from Northeast Brazil to share the gospel in other places like the Amazon, like Mozambique. We also are using this course in Portugal with some of our missionaries from Brazil that are in Portugal. We've used the course in Bolivia, in Colombia, in Venezuela. All of these are Brazilian missionaries that our churches have sent out to share the gospel in these places. And so we have a broad reach from Northeast Brazil. We're literally reaching the world. And that's what missions is all about, really. You all are sending missionaries, supporting missionaries from the United States. But our goal is that our churches in Brazil would also be having a missions vision to reach the world from Brazil. And so God is doing that. And so your ministry through us is actually expanded because we're reaching these other countries around the world. So that's a neat part. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of time to dedicate to those things like I want to, because I've primarily been focused on our church planting. But those are a couple of the areas that God has been using. I want to go back and talk a little bit about Cajazeiras and share what God is doing. There's lots of different pictures that I shared. You saw our boys. Fortunately, none of my family's in here. Is Sarah in here? I don't think she is. I have 3 boys, okay? And if you see them, they're Ruleys, if you know our family, because they're tall. Andrew may pass me up in the next couple of years. He's getting a lot taller. But we have taken advantage of living in Cajazeiras to reach out to our local community and try to be involved in the community in order to reach people within our community. The boys like to play soccer, okay? Of course, Brazil, they love soccer. Unfortunately, it's kind of a natural, well, everybody's kind of depressed about soccer right now. And if you follow soccer, you understand that, because even though the Brazilian team is really good, somehow they can never win in the World Cup. And so Brazilians are kind of hot and cold about soccer. But the boys have been able to be involved in soccer in Brazil. They play on a weekly basis on a team. Zachary's showing a lot of tendency to be a goalie, and so he's doing really well with that. When we first started playing soccer, our goal was to to become part of the community. And we found out how hard it is to become part of a small rural community in Northeast Brazil. We're foreigners, so we're already outsiders. We are Americans, so we speak English, so people find that interesting. But people also don't know what to do with us, so we're kind of there. We're friendly, we talk to people, and they're like, okay, and so I met an American, all right, so I'll go on along my way. But we've tried to consistently be in the same places. The boys are starting to play soccer. It took us 4 years of them consistently, weekly being in soccer for us to finally start to build good relationships with the soccer parents, with their coach, and we're now finally becoming a part of the community through the soccer that our boys are playing. Another area that we've been able to become part of the community is through English. Just like here in the States, people try to learn a foreign language. How many of you tried to learn Spanish? Some of you? How many of you failed to learn Spanish? Yeah, most of you, right? Same is true in Brazil. They try to learn English, they want to learn English, and most of them fail to speak English, okay? But they want to. They have a greater desire to speak English in Brazil than we do Spanish in the United States. Of course, we speak Portuguese in Brazil, but being part of the English community, the English-speaking community in Brazil has been very helpful. We have a number of people that speak English in our city because they've studied at the university. I have a number of English teachers that will invite me to their classes, and so I'll go into the public schools and I'll talk about Brazil, or I'll talk about the United States. I'll talk about English in Brazil and how you can better learn English. And they ask me about American culture. And so I'll go in and I'll give a presentation. I'll share about American culture. I'll share about the United States. And then the teachers will always ask me, why are you in Brazil? That's a good question, right? Why in the world would an American leave the United States and come to Brazil, to the middle of nowhere, to live? It's a really good question, right? I say, because you have everything. Northeast Brazil people think that Americans are rich, that they have lots of money, right? That everything is great in the United States because they've watched YouTube and they've watched movies, and they're just interested in anything American. And so I'm able to share, I'm here in the United States because of Jesus Christ, because he's changed my life, because money doesn't bring you happiness. Riches doesn't bring you happiness. Possessions don't bring you happiness. Being an American doesn't bring you happiness. It's only Jesus Christ. And I've been astounded to see over and over again, I'll be in a public school, okay? We're used to in the United States in public school, you can't talk about God. You can't read the Bible, right? You can't share your faith. In Brazil, you can. And these teachers, many of them are unbelievers. They're Catholic, or they really don't have any faith, will intentionally push me to share about my faith with the public school students. They'll ask me to invite their kids to church. They'll ask me questions about the Bible. And I have a regular, consistent, open door to go into the public schools and to share the gospel. It's a neat opportunity. It's something that I would have never expected. It's not something that I've looked for. But God opens doors for us to be involved in the community. Another opportunity that God has given us in Cajazeiras is with an English or with a music teacher. I'm not very musical. I like to sing, but I've never played an instrument. But we got connected with a music teacher in our city. He gives free lessons to the kids in our city. And he'll talk to us and he'll say, I would like you to be more involved in the lives of the kids that I'm reaching out to. These kids are struggling. Many of them don't have a hope or a future as a career, and so maybe they're not doing well in school. In Brazil, there's not a lot of good jobs. Most people depend on the government. Most of these kids get into drugs, they get into alcohol, they end up destroying their lives. And he said, Pastor, I want you to come on a weekly basis, and I want you to talk to these kids, and I want you to share with them from the Bible. Initially, he wanted me just to teach English, but he said, I want you just to share what it's like to be an American, but I want you to share what the Bible says about how you should live your life. He said, these kids need something. He's a Catholic man, very strongly Catholic man, but he sees the need for these kids to know the Bible, and so he's invited me to come back in a few, when we come back to the state, or we come back from the States at the beginning of January, and start on a weekly basis interacting with these kids. And so God opens these doors. People realize, whether they accept the gospel or not, the power of the gospel. They realize the need that lives need to be changed. There's a lot of hopelessness, there's a lot of depression, there's a lot of problems in Brazil. And so we have these open doors to share the gospel. I'm leaving all these pictures up here. I need to go through them. You can pass across to the next slide. There we go. As we're working with our church plant, I mentioned at the beginning of our time back in 2020, 2021, we weren't able to hold services, and so we had to do things online. And I kind of wondered if our church was going to survive. But our church actually began to thrive during the pandemic. We actually needed to expand our building. We met for the very first couple of years in a little teeny, at the top corner you see a picture of a very small space. It would be smaller than one of these sections of pews, and that's where we held our services. It was very hot. There was a fan that was blowing on me. We don't have air conditioning. We hold our services at night, on Sunday night, which is our main service. And most of our people sat on the sidewalk because it was too hot in our service. We quickly filled the entire space. But we've been blessed with a really good landlord who doesn't want to take advantage of us. We were able to take down the wall and expand our space, and we now have space for probably about 60 people to fit into our church building. Our people have caught the vision to church plant, to be part of our church from the very beginning. They've been faithful to give, and so they've been giving. We've used their money to purchase new chairs, to purchase a new sound system, to purchase fans, to purchase basically all of the things that we need for our church without having to ask for donations from the United States. So that's been really neat. They're taking ownership of their building. They're now paying the rent for their building because they don't need to pay for me as a missionary. And we actually have a large, well, not extremely large, but we actually have a little bit of money in the bank that God has provided for us to have. And so we're thankful for our people taking ownership and for our church to actually be able to expand its location. We now, as we look at the people that we have a little over 30 people there. We've been having visitors since I've been in the States. It's very hard to have visitors in Brazil. You invite people to church, you invite people to church, you invite people to church, you have special days, and they still won't come to church. It's crazy. It's been like beating our heads against the wall. We continue to do it, but what I found is you have to invest in people's lives outside of church. You have to visit in their homes. You have to spend time with them, and they have to become more comfortable with you before they come to church. It was really hard to get visitors to come while we were in Brazil. Since we've been in the States, they've had visitors almost every single week, so go figure it. Maybe I'm the problem, I don't know. I actually told them, I said, maybe I should stay in the States, and they're like, no, you have to come back, you have to come back. Well, we've had visitors every single week. Our church is almost full, and so we're thankful that we were able to expand that church. You can pass on to the next slide. One of the things, the major things that we've done, you can pass through this one. I already talked about that. And the next one. All right, there we go. One of the major ways that we have reached out to people has been through personal Bible studies. The vision of evangelism in Brazil has been primarily door-to-door evangelism, street preaching, and evangelistic services. And there's nothing wrong with those things, okay? Those things can be effective and can be used, but we found most effective in our ministry in Brazil has been personal one-on-one interaction with people. Brazilians are very friendly people. They're willing to open their home to you. Many people live in very humble settings. In fact, when you go into people's homes, if you're not used to it, I'm used to it by now, you'll be shocked at the things you see in people's homes. The simplicity of the houses that people live in. People live in very small houses, crammed together. Most Brazilian houses are side by side by side, and so there's not a lot of ventilation. It gets up to 90 degrees almost every single day, and so it's just hot and oppressive in a lot of these people's houses. A lot of people are very poor. But if you go to their house and you make a visit, they'll always have for you cafezinho, which is a sugared espresso. They'll always have some sort of snack, and they want you to come and sit at their table and talk. And Brazilian visits are not short visits, okay? If you go visit somebody here in the States, you stay for an hour, and I was like looking at their clock, and I got something else to do. You stay for 3 hours, you try to leave, and they say, no, stay. And then you stay 2 more hours, right? Just the way it is in Brazil. So you can do visits, but they take a long time. They'll end up taking up your entire day. But that's how we've seen God grow his church. That's the way we've seen things happen. We've had individual visits with people in our homes. Almost every single night we'll have individuals in our home. We'll have couples in our home that we'll be counseling. We have tried to do Bible studies, group Bible studies as a church. It's been a little more difficult because of the people that we have. Most of them have kids, and so they're busy with their jobs. They're busy taking care of their kids. But we've invested in individuals. We've invested in groups of ladies and men. We've done evangelistic studies with families. Some of those have borne fruit, some of them not. I want to share with you a quick story of a lady named Francisca. She's a lady in the center there. When she first started coming to our church, it was at the very beginning of our church plant. She told us that, I'm a Roman Catholic. I don't want to change my religion. But I like your church because you guys are nice. You treat me well. And so we just continue to encourage her to come to church. She had lots of problems, and she has lots of problems. She has 2 adult children that live with her. They take advantage of her. They live off of her generosity. She has lots of physical problems. She turned 70 last year, but she just really struggles with lots of things. She struggled with depression. She struggled with fear of death. But we continue to invest in her. We continue to encourage her to come to church. I would go and visit her, and she's kind of like a grandma. And so she would take care of me. She'd give me coffee. She'd give me food. I would go over there and listen to her. What I found in evangelism, you have to listen to people. You have to learn that people need to share what's going on in their hearts, and you need to know what's going on before you can apply the gospel to their hearts. And so I would go over to her house, and I remember I would go over there, and she would just talk. She would do, we use a word in Portuguese, desabafar, which is spill your guts. And she would share for like 2 or 3 hours. And of course, I speak Portuguese, but I don't always understand everything. And the way she speaks is not always easy to understand. So I'd be, yep. And she would give me more coffee. But I got a good understanding of some of the things going on in her heart. We were praying for her. And I remember she would have these ups and downs. So she would be going through these challenges, and then she would disappear for a while, and then she would come back to church. It was almost like she knew this was at least a place that people that cared for her. But I went over to her house one day, and she shared with me for 3 hours things going on in her life. I was like, I got to go. And she said, Pastor, aren't you here to read the Bible with me? And I was like, yeah, actually I am. We had given her a Bible. And so I got out my Bible, or I got out her Bible, and I read from her a psalm. And I just shared for what it meant. This is who God is. This is who we are. This is what we need. And I don't think anyone had ever sat down with her. She had gone to church, so she had heard preaching messages. She had a Bible in her home, but she didn't know how to read it. She didn't know how to understand it. And I found in a lot of ways like Philip the evangelist in Scripture, who, talking to the Ethiopian eunuch, he says, I have this and I'm reading this, but I have no idea what it means. And so I explained it to her. And we prayed with her, and the crazy thing is that I felt like a door is opening up, and then she fell and broke her arm, and she was in the hospital, and she was gone for like 2 months. I was like, man, the devil's really working. Because that was a great opportunity to start to share the gospel with her. But she came back. This happened multiple times until finally last fall, she came to me and she came to Sarah, and she said, we need to meet every single week. I'm going to come over to your house because my house is too distracting, and I want you to talk to me about the Bible. And we did. It took 4 or 5 months of doing this, but she finally made a profession of faith and she accepted Christ as her Savior. And that was an amazing thing. She had just turned 70 years old, a confirmed Catholic that we thought would never change, but showing the love of Christ, showing compassion, explaining scripture to her, investing in her personal life, God used for her to accept Christ. And what was neat is on June 8th, we held a baptism shortly before we came back to the States. You don't think of a baptismal service as an evangelistic event, right? But it is, or it could be, right? A lot of times our baptisms are held in church, right? It's basically among believers. We hold our baptisms in Brazil more publicly. We rent a place called a chácara, which is kind of like a outdoor hangout spot. They'll have a place where you can roast meat. They'll have some places where you can hang up some hammocks. They'll have a pool. And so we rented out this space. We told them to invite anyone that wanted to come. We invited a local church. It's about 40 minutes away to come be a part of the service. And we had 20 unsaved visitors come to our baptism service. It's crazy. When she started telling me all the people she was inviting, I was like, man, I can't believe that these people even come, right? But they all came. Most of them were her family and friends. One of them, one of her friends that I've known for a while, she's a Catholic, and she says the same thing. She'll never change. She doesn't attend our church, but she said, I have to see it to believe it, that she's actually getting baptized and that she's actually a believer. And so all these people came to our baptism service. I got to share the gospel, both preaching the gospel and also visually showing the gospel to them through baptism, and I had an opportunity to talk with multiple of these family members, get to know them, share my life with them, invite them to church. What's neat is one of the girls that came to that baptism was a friend of Francisca's. I'd never met her before. We got to visit with her a couple more times before we came back to the States. She started attending our church right after we came back to the States. She brought her mom and her family. They've been attending the church, and both her mom and her made decisions for Christ since we've been in the United States. And so God is working. You have to invest in people. I don't know how he does that because I can't take credit for that. You have to be faithful. You have to invest in people. But we're thankful how God saved Francisca, how God is changing her life, how God is giving opportunities. You can skip all the way to the end. There you go, right there. And I'll share with you a picture of our church. This is our group of people. There's about 30 people I sent in our church. The name of our church is Igreja Batista Regular da Fé, or Faith Regular Baptist Church, okay? Faith Baptist Church is an important name. It's actually kind of a coincidence. It's kind of named after this church, believe it or not. So when I was growing up, of course, I grew up here at Faith. My wife, Sarah, grew up at a Faith Baptist Church in Muskegon, Michigan. And when we moved to Brazil, the first church that we attended was a Faith Baptist Church as well. And so we decided to name our church Faith Baptist Church. And so it's kind of neat to make those things go full circle. And we appreciate your prayers that the church will be planted. We have a lot of work to do to develop our men. We have no leadership in our church yet, men that are qualified for leadership. We don't have official organization yet, so we have lots of things to do financially, legally, discipleship-wise to develop these group of people. But we're thankful how God is planting his church in Cajazeiras. We're basically out of time, but if you have any questions, I can try to answer a couple questions in the couple minutes that we have before service. If not, you can talk to me during the service, after the service. We'll be here all week. I say that as a joke, but we'll be around during the week as well. So anyone have any questions?
You said it was a university. Now, what's the population like between the university and the regular population?
I'm not exactly sure how many students are in the university. I don't think there's more than 10,000 students in the university, so it's not a lot of students. Most of them stay on campus, and so we don't have a lot of contact with the students, but it's a lot less. It's actually a branch campus of the main campus in the capital, and so it's smaller in that respect. So, yes.
Do you have in your congregation that attends that college?
We have one guy who actually came to us because he studies at the university, which is pretty neat. He came from a city called Sobral. And so we've been trying to open a chapter of, there are student organizations, Christian student organizations in Brazil. but it's a lot more technical, and we haven't been able to open up a student initiative in the campus yet, but that's something that we've talked about. That's something he's trying to do, but so far he's the only one that he's been able to get a group together. So, that's one of the things we're hoping to do next year. Yes.
You mentioned there was a difference between having the satellite church and a totally new church. What are the pros and cons of planting a new church versus having a satellite church?
I don't know that there's necessarily totally pros and cons. In Brazil, at least, the satellite church often just kind of stagnates, and so it isn't doing anything unless the mother church is helping them. You can do both. A lot of reasons why there's a satellite church is because they aren't able to sustain themselves. So they're in a poor community, and so they're not actually able to support a preacher. They're not actually able to have their own church. As long as a church is reaching out to their community and they're doing it of their own will instead of waiting for someone else to come in and do it for them. A lot of times that happens in Brazil. You have a community, but they have to send the preacher from outside. They have to send somebody to play music from outside. They have to send all the money from outside, and the church kind of stagnates. So as long as the satellite church is taking the initiative, it can work, but unfortunately a lot of churches are dependent on something from outside, which also fits the way Brazilians think. The government pays for lots of things, and so the money comes from outside, and so they wait for somebody to do something instead of taking initiative. So we're trying to stimulate that as well. So, yes.
You work with those men to talk about starting churches elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
You all get together and just go to an area and just have like a big meeting and try to, how do you choose where you're going to try to set up a church?
Each of the churches where they're located, because our pastors are located in different locations, they're looking at the communities close to them. They're looking at neighborhoods close to them. There's a lot of strategy involved in looking at a local neighborhood, and if it's a growing neighborhood, trying to find a piece of property within that location and then starting to hold services as the area is growing. It really just depends. Some of our pastors are in small cities where there's not a lot of growth, but they're trying to reach into a local rural community. We're part of a church plant where there's a large growing city called Petrolina, and there's a new neighborhood that is growing. So we purchased a piece of property. They had a group of people that wanted to start the church, and so they trained those people, organized those people to already start holding services. They started the church after 2 years of training, preparation, and evangelism within the local community. When they held the first service, they had almost 100 visitors from outside the church. And so they're trying to do something very different, where instead of starting to hold services right away, they're trying to interact with the community. They do football or soccer, if you will. They do soccer outreaches, they do children's outreaches, and they're trying to get an interest in the community before they actually start the church. So everything is different. It all depends on the situation. Some places more rural, you have to do it differently, but we're trying to do what we call contextualization, is figure out what's happening in the location and how best to share the gospel in that situation. So, any other questions? I think we need to probably end it. So if you have any more questions, you can feel free to ask me, talk to me afterwards. It's good to be here, and we appreciate your prayers and your support for us.